The year was 1962. The world was split between two ideologies: capitalism, supported by the United States, and communism, endorsed by the Soviet Union. The situation between Washington, D.C. and Moscow had steadily worsened after the end of World War II. Although they were once allies in the face of Nazi aggression, differences in political and social values opened a chasm between the two nations, marked by proxy wars and aggressive military posturing. The threat of mankind's newest and most powerful weapon, the atom bomb, loomed ominously above every move in the international arena. The 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis steered the course of the Cold War from conflict to compromise. Welcome to Cuba, 1956. Cuban lawyer-turned-revolutionary Fidel Castro leads his homegrown revolutionary movement in a guerrilla war against the dictatorship established by Fulgencio Batista, a former Cuban general who had overthrown the democratically elected government of Cuba and instituted tyranny, eliminating government processes, facilitating rampant corruption, and widening economic inequality. After nearly 3 years of failed attempts to shut down Castro's revolutionaries, Batista fled Cuba, allowing Castro to parade triumphantly into Havana to cheers of Viva Fidel. But the celebration was premature. Cuba was a newly formed, unstable communist government just 90 miles from the coast of the United States. It's easy to see why Cuba quickly became an object of concern for President Dwight Eisenhower, who feared that the American sphere of influence would be disrupted by the presence of Castro's communist regime so close to the U.S. heartland. Thus, almost immediately after Castro gained power in Cuba, the U.S. shut off all diplomatic and economic connection with it.
And maybe I was a little more aware than some people about the Cuban issue because my family took me to Cuba when I was 7 years old, which was much before that. And then it was shut off. You know, I got to see it before it was shut off. And I remembered walking along the Prada, and I thought, I wonder what happened to that storekeeper that I met when I was there when I was 7 years old. I never knew.
1961, just 2 years after Castro took power, following a series of failed assassination attempts, the CIA organized a group of U.S. forces and counter-revolutionary paramilitaries to invade Cuba through the southern Bay of Pigs, a move which ultimately failed. However, the attack served as a forceful wake-up slap to Cuba. Castro now knew that the U.S. would not hesitate to aggress against his new government. With this in mind, he sought out the help of the world's most powerful communist government, the Soviet Union, to stop any further breaches of Cuban sovereignty. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, was happy to oblige. He agreed to send 40 nuclear missile launchers to Cuba to deter further U.S. invasions and expand the Soviet sphere of influence into the Western Hemisphere. However, these secret plans were foiled when the U.S. received a tip-off from Olev Penkovsky, a spy for the U.S. in the GRU, the Soviet military agency. Penkovsky informed CIA agents in Britain and France that the Soviet Union planned to ship nuclear missiles to Cuba. This confirmed the suspicions of the U.S. Air Force, who had observed Soviet ships bringing strange cargo and routine surveillance of Cuba. On October 14th, a U-2 spy plane was sent to take additional aerial photographs. For hours, pictures from the spy plane mission and technical details provided by Penkovsky were analyzed by the CIA. In the end, the U.S.'s worst nightmare was confirmed. There were Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. On the very next day, October 16, 1962, the Secretary of State informed President Kennedy, who gathered with cabinet members and advisors to formulate a plan to resolve the situation. There were two main approaches advocated. The first, a direct airstrike on the missiles in Cuba, followed by another invasion of Cuba. The second, a letter of warning to Khrushchev, followed by negotiations and compromise. After much deliberation, Kennedy decided to blockade Cuba, preventing it from receiving additional weaponry from the Soviets, and tackle the Soviets in the private and public spheres, sending a private letter to Khrushchev and delivering a public speech on television to communicate a desire for peace above all else.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
After seeing photos of the missiles on the news, the American public was plagued with uncertainty and fear.
It's just like a fencer who probes with the sword one place just to see what happens, how you react. You don't know.
As the public held their breath in anticipation of imminent nuclear apocalypse, Washington and Moscow frantically exchanged letters. In his first reply to Kennedy, Khrushchev stated that he was unwilling to obey the blockade or stand down because the nuclear weapons transferred to Cuba were already functional and ready to deploy. In his mind, it would be foolish to give up the leverage he had just acquired without getting something in return. To further complicate this situation, while negotiations were intense between the two governments, small-scale military engagement erupted. On October 27th, the 11th day of the Cuban Missile Crisis, 2 American U-2 planes were shot down, the first while conducting another round of spying in Cuba, and the second when it accidentally wandered into Soviet airspace over Siberia. Due to these incidents, both militaries were on high alert, ready to engage at any moment. When the USS Beale, an American destroyer, dropped non-lethal charges on a Soviet nuclear submarine to ask it to rise to the surface for communication purposes, 2 of the 3 Soviet commanders on the submarine misunderstood the signal, thinking that World War III had begun and the submarine should launch its nuclear missiles to destroy the American ship above. If the Soviet submarine had fired its missiles, the US would have been provoked into activating the Single Integrated Operational Plan, which would have sent over 5,000 nuclear missiles to locations all around the world, including China, Russia, and Albania. With Soviet retaliation guaranteed, such an event would have thrown human civilization into a downward spiral of death. However, the 3rd commander of the submarine, Vasily Arkhipov, refused to certify the missile attack. His veto saved the hundreds of Americans aboard the USS Beale and the billions of people all around the world. And as disaster was averted at sea, a deal was struck atop Capitol Hill. After another series of letters between Kennedy and Khrushchev, the compromise was finalized. The Soviets would remove its missiles from Cuba, while the United States would publicly promise not to invade Cuba and secretly remove its missiles from Turkey and Italy, areas which Khrushchev felt threatened the safety of Soviet citizens. At last, the Cuban Missile Crisis was over. The period of almost 2 weeks between October 16th and October 28th, 1962, was the closest to nuclear annihilation that humanity has ever been. However, the risk of nuclear war was not something new to the American public. From desk drills to the constant witch hunt of communists abroad and at home, the public was hyper-aware of this tension. The peaceful conclusion of the Cuban Missile Crisis marked an overarching reduction of aggression between the US and the USSR. With nuclear weapons withdrawn from Cuba, Turkey, and Italy, both Americans and Soviets felt less threatened by the other people, agreeing to joint ventures such as the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which prohibited the testing of nuclear weapons above ground, restricting the development of future atomic bombs and decreasing the likelihood of false positives, accidental misinterpretation of an atomic test as a nuclear attack. Later, during the joint Apollo-Soyuz mission in 1975, Soviet and American astronauts even journeyed into space together, putting aside their earthly differences and exploring the cosmos for the good of humanity. Until the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War in 1991, the US and USSR officials continued to collaborate on integrating the Western and Eastern blocs, even as they indirectly sabotaged each other.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
And when the Soviet Union finally did fall to the pressure of democratic actors, the USA recognized it not as an enemy, but as a friend. For decades, the Soviet Union and the United States has seen each other as other, the enemy, untrustworthy. Yet despite the urging of hawkish advisors on both sides, President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev still decided to emphasize their desire for peace in public statements and remain open to negotiations with one another, by cooperating to put an end to the nuclear one-upmanship of the previous period of the Cold War. They brought us from conflict to compromise.
You could almost compare it to North Korea now. We just want to show off, see what you're going to do. How far can we go? And we don't know. We just have to test.